New, more sustainable technologies are springing up all the time, and with them are a range of new challenges, including materials that are needed and processes for generating, creating, or extracting those materials from the earth. And that's what we're thinking about today on the show is all about what this new electrification of the world means, especially around lithium mining and other critical minerals that will be needed in the coming decades, and how we can think about both reducing that demand and the implications of what's going to happen when we start dredging up and mining out those minerals from around the world. I'm Weston Twardowski, the Associate Director of Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and Associate Director of Eco Studio and Rice's Sustainability Institute, and you're listening to Gulf Streams on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM, where we talk with leading experts and community leaders to better understand the environmental problems and potential solutions facing our community. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Dr. Thea Riofrancos is Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College, and she's a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute, and a deep thinker about not only climate change, but especially the green transition, and the author of the recent book Extraction, which I am delighted to get to talk to you about today. Dr. Riofrancos, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So, just to start us off, to talk about extraction, the frontiers of green capitalism, you're thinking through a lot of things in this book, especially the real tangible impacts of what the green transition means, in particular around lithium ion mining. And so, without giving too much of an overview of the book, I'd love to just hear about when did you become interested in this and what drove you into thinking about extraction in terms of how we're moving through this new green economy.
Yeah, my interest in extraction predates my interest in climate change or my interest in the energy transition. So it's really resource extraction and the politics around that, the harms of it, the kind of whole mess of it that brought me into being interested in climate change and then being interested in the energy transition and then kind of bringing that full circle like, oh, the energy transition also has implications for resource extraction.
Mhm.
And so, I as a scholar and like, when I was doing my PhD, my main interest was extractive sectors in Latin America, the political economy, the protests, the environmental harm, all of those things. And then over time, I became someone that felt, really urgently like the climate crisis was our most existential challenge and that an energy transition was necessary. And I started to think through like and really just stumble upon in certain ways that the energy transition that I was advocating for in the US or anywhere in the world would have implications for mining and for the frontline communities and landscapes that that impacts, which gave me a lot of pause. It didn't mean that I wasn't very a very strong advocate for renewable energy and for climate policy, but it did feel a little bit like an inner conflict or something like that when I first discovered this intersection, let's say, early in my research process. And I decided to really just lean into that, to not shy away from what felt like an uncomfortable, perhaps conflict or tension between different goals or values of mine. One is that we need urgent climate action and an urgent energy transition, and the other that there's a biodiversity crisis, that there's, indigenous rights that are being violated around the world, that landscape protection is really important. And it felt like those were in conflict. And so I decided that I wanted to address that seeming conflict. I didn't know if the conflict was real or imagined. Like, are there ways to avoid it? Are there other routes to the energy transition? I was kind of open because, as I said, extraction was what I knew much better. The energy transition, energy policies was what I was kind of learning about, at the time and thinking through and exploring. I decided to go to Chile, particularly to see how this kind of all hits the ground, as you said. But I ended up in other places as well, and we'll get into those. And what I came away with, without answering all the questions you might answer, but just to kind of explain how this inner conflict unfolded, is that there are tensions, and those tensions are real. They're quite material, I guess we could say. But I don't think we need to sacrifice one of these goals in the interest of the other. I think that there's a lot more complementarity and intersection, and a lot more ways in which all of these crises or environmental harms and climate harms are caused by similar structures and underlying processes. And so that took me years to really think through. But at the beginning, I felt the inner conflict, and I wanted to explore it more with communities, with specific landscapes, with policymakers, with all the people that I ended up interviewing.
Well, and I think that tension is fascinating. We're going to get more into it, but I think just for folks who aren't as deep in the weeds on this, to start us off, can you just talk a little bit about? I think folks are familiar with the idea of mining and renewable energy. They've probably heard of cobalt, maybe they've heard of lithium, and they're kind of vaguely aware that some of these minerals are needed for green technology. Can you just walk us through a little more specifically? And I mean, I know you're really invested in thinking about lithium and the use of lithium ion batteries. So I'm happy to just stay in that arena. But I'd like to hear a little bit, why do we need these minerals? Why do we need to extract these things for this clean energy transition that we're imagining?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and it's because it's not per se intuitive why more mining would be needed, especially when the overarching demand of the climate justice movement for many years has been something like keep it in the ground. Like we need to keep oil and gas and coal in the ground or phase them out as rapidly as possible in order to avoid, even more dangerous scenarios of global warming and the planetary crisis that would bring. And so a lot of what climate justice and an energy transition is advocating for is less extraction, right?
Mhm.
But and yet it also involves building out new systems of technology, of infrastructure, of how we interact with those things. And that physical stuff, the solar panels, the transmission lines, the wind turbines, the electric grid and all of its components, but also transportation systems, decarbonized forms of mobility, electric forms of mobility, even thinking of like how are we going to build buildings and make them zero carbon, right? So zero carbon forms of building materials or greener forms of steel. I mean, these are just, we could keep going because the climate crisis, the causes of our runaway emissions have many physical causes to them, and all of those systems need to be replaced. And so that's an engineering task, it's an infrastructure task, and each of those specific infrastructures, whether it's a solar panel, a wind turbine, an electric vehicle, the whole body, just the battery, whatever it is, when we trace out like how are those produced, what are their basic inputs, then we end up all the way upstream, to use that language, up these kind of supply chains to their kind of origin points. We end up in deposits of minerals, and that is really where a solar panel gets its beginning. Whether we're talking about rare earths or a battery, with lithium or cobalt or nickel, or a wind turbine, again, rare earths really important there. And all of these things tend to also involve steel and aluminum, which also are based on,
Mhm.
mineral ores. And so there's just, mining is relevant to every aspect of the energy transition. One crucial difference, though, because I don't want anyone to get blackpilled by that fact, to use kind of internet language, but to get like nihilistic, like, okay, it's all the same, like fossil capitalism, green capitalism, it's all extractive. And there's like a, a simplistic truth there that's true. All of this does involve interface with non-renewable resources in the earth. But there is a critical difference, which is that a fossil fuel based energy system, whether we talk about producing electricity or whether we talk about, how we get to work and sort of mobility and transportation, involves ongoing, constant extraction for fuel.
Mhm.
That fuel is then just burned. We burn it in a gas-powered power plant, excuse me, or a coal-powered power plant. We burn it with the gasoline in our car. Some of that is actually just lost as like waste heat, and we never even use it all, so it's actually quite inefficient. But regardless, we're constantly burning things that were extracted from the earth in order to power our daily lives. The major benefit, among a few, of like a renewable energy system, in addition to like drawing down, our emissions, which is critical, the major other benefit is actually that we don't need to keep extracting these minerals as fuel. We need to extract them to do a kind of build out of a new system. Thereafter, in theory, we would move into a much less extractive system because the
Mm,
stuff would be built and the energy is from the sun or from the wind or from geothermal. It doesn't require extraction and it's renewable. It's not non-renewable, right? And so that's an important difference, but the devil's in the details and we'll get into this. There are a lot of reasons that I remain concerned about the volume of extraction required under prevailing approaches to the energy transition, and maybe more importantly, about the fact that we're not cleanly transitioning from one type of extraction to another. We're kind of doing it all in a variety of ways, and that's something I'm happy to talk more about if of interest.
I definitely want to get to that because I think it's one of, yeah, the dynamic arguments in the book, that kind of everything happening all at once. A little bit of a everything anywhere. What was that movie from a few years ago with the
Yeah.
everything bagel? Little bit of that going on in there. But first, I want to, I mean, something that I think was interesting that you were just describing to get to this, renewable system where ideally we're able to recycle a lot of these materials, where the infrastructure is built out, that we see these massive drops in extraction. We have seen things like data centers pop up and these electricity demands just skyrocket. And so, one thing I'm wondering about is just as we build out these systems, what is how are we measuring this kind of imagined future energy use, knowing that we keep creating new ways to consume energy, and will that keep up with that demand?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of growth and growing demand in the energy sector, and a lot of growing demand kind of relatedly for the minerals that power or are inputs for a lot of different technologies, right? And so, I think one of the concerning things about our moment is that it's not really clear, at least in the United States, right? This might be a little different of how it's elsewhere in the world, but in the United States, it's clear that like there's a lot of energy demand coming from, some existing attempts at electrification and decarbonization. Those have been thrown off course a bit by Trump and the White House and, the current government, but they're also still happening. Like if you look at demand for like and growth in like the solar power sector or in just purchases of electric vehicles, like we're not where we were a few years ago. Those things are still growing. They're bigger sectors than they used to be. Now layered on top of that, we have a major push coming from industry, but also from government for, data centers and AI. And those are super energy intensive, right? To the point where, like, especially given Trump's like interest in fossil fuels, we're like reopening coal plants that were going to be closed just to serve for data centers, or we're building new gas powered plants, sometimes captive gas powered power plants. Captive means that what they're being used for is just like a specific company or industry or data center. They're not even serving the broader
Mm,
grid, but it like shows you how much energy demand there is. In addition, all of these require minerals as well, right? The semiconductors, the batteries that are being used, not, they're batteries in cars, but we also use batteries in data centers for backup, to ensure ongoing energy supply if there's like a blackout or like a momentary, glitch in the energy grid, right? Then, in addition to that, just to put this on the table, we also have really growing militarism and military expenditures around the world. And the military, the US military and other militaries, are major consumers of a lot of these technologies, right? Drone warfare and these kind of remote operated technologies, also just regular kinds of military hardware are use batteries. They might have computing technology and semiconductors, right? And so it's a lot of different things at once that we see leaders again in sort of industry and the government around the world and very much in the US pushing for. And there's no clear prioritization happening. It's not at all clear, especially again, I won't keep saying the Trump government and the obviousness of what their politics are, but, especially at this moment in US politics, it's really unclear what we're prioritizing. The Trump government has a major interest in AI and a major interest in militarism and much less of an interest in renewable energy, though they also have this kind of energy dominance and energy security framework that in theory could promote any type of energy, but there's much more promotion of fossil fuels and secondarily nuclear and then geothermal. They are actually actively making it difficult to build out solar and wind, offshore wind right now. So It's a bit of a mess. Ideally, there are ways to sequence and prioritize these different energy needs and mineral needs. And we could, if we had the capacity and the sort of institutional venues in which we could make real collective decisions over these things, we might say that renewable energy for social needs, like for basic needs of how we're getting around or how we're heating or powering our homes, is the priority, right? In order to decarbonize and also just to have clean and reliable forms of energy for everybody. But my worry is that these other sectors and their really high energy demands, again, mostly AI and also the military sector, are kind of crowding out necessary investments and capacity for just everyday community needs. And we're seeing that. I think we're seeing that pretty clearly, and it's pretty concrete with people's utility bills and why they're going up. And so there are different reasons, and the electricity market is a complicated one. But in various energy markets in our country, because they're decentralized, the main reason that bills are going up does have to do with this data center pressure. And so people are actually ordinary payers are paying for this, are not getting any clear or immediate benefit. And meanwhile, we're not making the rapid progress we need on decarbonization or electrification.
Which I think, there's certainly the climate change argument of why we need electrification. I think that's something, regular listeners of the show have heard us talk about. And if you haven't heard us talk about it, please go back and listen to our archive and, listen into why we think electrification is a necessary step around mitigating emissions. But I think that, even if we were to kind of pull back from that across the country, I think you're seeing a lot of folks in the political middle, on the political left, and even some on the right who are really saying, just with the rising energy demands, we need an everything, at the table kind of approach, where we can't sideline renewables right now when there's this growing demand. Other places around the world, we've seen China just build up spectacularly in the green space. I mean, it's really astounding the degree to which they have moved into a much more electric, solar, wind kind of space. So, kind of regardless of what the US policy is at the moment, I don't think renewables are going away in this country, and they are certainly not globally. That feels safe, which does pull us back to this conversation of your book, which I mean really puts us at these materials are going to be needed, and we're going to need them to continue building up this infrastructure. So I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the where we're finding these minerals and what some of the consequences of this. I think, folks broadly are probably going to hear mining and be like, yeah, probably not the best thing for the environment. But what does that actually look like in practice? What are some of those tangible impacts that mining for these minerals has?
Hmm. The map of lithium mining and of mining for some of these other so-called critical minerals for the energy transition has changed to some degree over the years that I've been working on this. And yet, the main producers are still the main producers. And so I can relay that pretty easily. There's four-ish major lithium producers, which are Australia, Chile, Argentina, China, or China, Argentina, if we want to go in exact order. China we can put aside for a moment, not because it's not fascinating and there's also environmental harm for their lithium mining, but the lithium mined in China like stays in China more,
Mm,
whereas the lithium mined in these other places is all exported, a lot of it to China, but
mm.
also to Europe and the US and wherever else, the rest of the downstream production of batteries and electric vehicles is taking place. So right off the bat, I'm saying, there's a handful of countries that account for the vast majority of the lithium market currently. That could make people think that lithium is really scarce or only exists in those countries. That's not the case. And so I just want to say that right away that lithium is quite abundant, which is why, like, abundant in a geological sense, but its supply, where it comes from, has been pretty concentrated, partly because it's been a kind of small resource market for decades, mainly serving like consumer electronics, which are ubiquitous, but they're small. So they
Mhm.
don't need a huge volume. Once we get into the EV revolution, like the EV takeoff in China, in Europe, and then kind of the US lagging a bit, but still growing market here. Then we get into much bigger volumes and a market that might need to grow pretty dramatically in size if it's going to really meet the growing consumer demand for this critical input. So that's kind of just where we are at in a market sense, a little bit of a basics on lithium geologically. And so when I said it's abundant, that implies that we could extract it in other places, and that's starting to happen. We're seeing growing lithium mining in Canada, in Brazil, in Zimbabwe, in the U.S. As well, and or mining mines that are under construction, and in Europe mines that are under construction or at least being fully financed. And so, how do we take all of this in? What is the impact of all of this? How might the impacts be different in some of these different places? Lithium is an interesting element because it is a very reactive alkaline metal. That's like the type of element it is. Not, and I won't get too scientific, but just to stay with this for a moment, what that means is lithium doesn't exist in like a pure form anywhere in nature. It exists in these different compounds. And what that means is that there are very different types of lithium deposits, each of which have different environmental impacts associated with their extraction. And I won't be too exhaustive, but just to give us a sense of the range, I mentioned Australia. The lithium there, and I didn't do research there, but I've read a lot about it because it's the number one lithium producer. The lithium there is the more traditional way that we would think about mining, like hard rocks that
Mm.
are like broken up. They're excavated, they're broken up, they're sent in relatively unprocessed form to China for further refining. And that refining in China is pretty energy intensive and pretty polluting on the local level there. In Australia, a lot of the issue is like the sheer physical waste and also carbon emissions, because when you're moving lots of rock, you leave behind a lot of rock that doesn't have the valuable stuff in it, and also you just need a lot of energy to break up that rock and get it into the further down supply chain. So that's the Australia situation in brief. In Chile, where I did quite a bit of research, the lithium there takes a totally different form, which is that it is in subsurface liquid mines. It seems kind of bizarre to think about, but we're talking about salt flats, which might be a type of landscape some listeners are familiar with. They exist in the U.S. West as well, and they're everywhere in the world. So these are just kind of crusty salt formations that are beautiful to hike around in and walk around in. They are, in the case of Chile and other places, kind of high altitude and in mountainous areas. They can also be, in other types of basins as well. But anyway, salt flats. Underneath a salt flat is lithium brine. Brine we know is salt water, and so this is salt water. It's actually much saltier than actually ocean water is, and it has these lithium ions, dissolved in it. And so what that mining looks like is you're pumping out this liquid from underground to the surface so that you can work with it. And then once it's in the surface, you're actually letting the sun do a lot of work to evaporate the water, because the Atacama Desert, which we haven't talked about a lot yet, but I'll kind of bring it in now. This is the northern desert of Chile, where a fifth of the world's lithium comes from. The Atacama Desert is an extremely dry and extremely high solar radiation landscape. And so the sun helps concentrate this lithium rich liquid, and then there's further chemical processing elsewhere and so forth. But what's the problem here? Like, what are the impacts? There's several. I'll start with biodiversity. There's increasing evidence that the lithium mining has a negative impact on some beautiful, amazing, like endemic species that live in the area, like flamingos. They migrate and they use these salt flats in their migratory route. They hang out there for a while. They snack on different organisms and that live right in the salty lagoons on top of the salt flat, so that you can see this if you go to nature preserves elsewhere on the salt flat, not where the mining is, but elsewhere. But what biologists are showing is that the populations of those flamingos have been affected and are decreasing related to the mining. We don't actually know exactly why. It might be the noise disruption, it might be the water disruption, which I'll get to in a moment. There's different causal pathways there. But another huge impact, and this is the one that is probably most concerning to local communities, is the impact on water.
Mm.
And so even though brine water is not directly drank by anybody, or I mean, you might drink it, but you probably spit it out because it's very salty. And so, the companies will say, oh, this has no impact because all we're doing is removing the salt water that no one cares about. it turns out, and many scientific reports and also actions taken by the Chilean government in an attempt to regulate and sometimes, have legal actions against these companies, all of this evidence has shown that underneath the salt flat, we have salt water. But as we go towards the perimeter and we get out of the salt flat, what's underground is freshwater aquifers. And those are connected to one another. The freshwater aquifers and the saltwater aquifers, this underground water storage system that naturally exists, is interconnected. And so when you remove tons of salt water, there's evidence that you actually draw down and lower the fresh water that is porously kind of interfacing with the salt water. And I know that is a bit technical, but just the takeaway is that removing the salt water makes the fresh water less accessible and might bring fresh water actually into the saltwater area and further dilute the salt flats, but that's not so relevant for our freshwater purposes. Just kind of make the freshwater less accessible to humans, to animals, for agriculture, for consumption, for whatever it is. And there is quite a bit of evidence that this is happening, that this process is happening. As you can tell from me describing it, it's complicated. This is like a subsurface change that's happening in the water system. It's therefore easy in a way for companies to deny that this is occurring because it's not visible per se to the human eye, but there's a lot of scientific and also anecdotal evidence from communities like having trouble accessing their own wells and being able to use water for irrigation purposes or for household consumption. And so the biodiversity issues, the water issues, there's also waste issues because there are salts and other, precipitants and other things that are kind of left behind after the evaporation. And then there's social issues too that are just as important and we shouldn't ignore, which has been the fact that for decades prior to this year, or like the current government and some recent policies, but for many decades, all of this lithium mining has happened without anything that we could call prior consultation or prior consent of indigenous communities, despite Chile being party to international laws and norms and conventions that say indigenous people should be asked before really environmentally impactful stuff is done on their territory. And Chile recognizes that, but has not enforced it until recently. In fact, the first consultation processes ever, but this mining has been going on for a while, like just happened this year for a new project or for an expansion of a project. But really the core mining operations, which are two companies, SQM and Albemarle, one of them is Chilean, the other is American, but they're both like shareholder-owned multinationals. Their operations have not been subject to the kind of norms of international law that Chile has, at least formally subscribed to. And so there's social harms, there's environmental harms, and that's resulted in protest, in conflict, in division, in different feelings about whether this is a good or bad industry. Does it matter that it's helping with climate change? Should we just put up with it? Or do our local issues matter more? Just lots of conversations in the frontline communities and their allies and advocates elsewhere.
Well, and some of those seem like they are maybe not resolvable, but certainly addressable through policy in different ways. And some of those feel like these are, hard challenges that we just are going to have to grapple with and assess. And I think that's something you stress throughout the book is like holding in tension multiple things at once. And I mean, one of the points to that is, in the early part of the book, you really break apart, it's both true that it takes longer now to start up mining and that we're able to do so more quickly and that these things can exist at the same time. And so I'd love to hear some because you've alluded to some of the policy landscape, but I think what you haven't talked about in our conversation that you go into a good bit in the book is there's this need for these materials to build up these infrastructures we're trying to build, and simultaneously they've really struggled in some cases to get off the ground. That there have been like price drops that have really made the industry difficult to get on the ground. And so can you just walk us through a little bit the kind of complex landscape of both trying to start up these extractive practices so we can build out like clean electric grids, and simultaneously that we're facing periods of time in the future where it looks like we're not going to have enough of this, even if we have maybe too much of it in a certain moment right now.
Yeah, commodities markets and a commodity and kind of econ 101 language just tends to refer to these globally traded raw materials, right? So
Mhm.
it could be oil or copper, but it could also be beef or soy or corn, right? I mean, so anything that is a
Anything
kind of
we trade.
anything we trade, but not like a t-shirt, right? So like a raw material thing that we trade, whether it's agricultural or extractive sector. And so lithium is a commodity in that sense. Like other minerals, I mentioned copper or hydrocarbon, like oil. And commodity sectors have a couple of features to them, and lithium in interesting ways like is really exemplary, like in a kind of dramatic way, showing what these features are. They tend to have boom and bust cycles,
Mhm.
and that's because it can be hard to match supply and demand in like a given moment, on a given day, in a given week, in a given month, in a way that's different for like manufactured goods or service sectors or other types of markets. And that's because we are fundamentally working with nature on some level, whether we are harvesting, a crop, or whether we are extracting a non-renewable mineral deposit. In either case, like we're interfacing with nature, we're relying on natural processes that we can't fundamentally control as humans. Like there are elements outside of our control, right?
Yeah.
So one thing is just on the kind of physical, geophysical level, or like, are we in a really warm year or a really dry year and our harvests totally change and a individual farmer can't change that. So maybe, we've had issues with like chocolate prices spiking or coffee prices spiking. So that's a kind of boom and bust in the more agricultural commodity sphere. Those tend to sort out a little bit more quickly though, but they can be really volatile. In mineral markets, it's different because it's a really long lag sometimes between when we get peak demand and when we can bring that supply online. And so this is what you're referring to a few years ago with lithium in particular, but also with a few other battery minerals. I think nickel was in that category of having some pretty sharp price increases, and that's because there might be moments due to policy changes or other market or consumer behavior changes where there's a lot of demand for something. Like all of a sudden, a few years ago, lots of more people on Earth started buying electric vehicles. That was really driven by policy, right? So this is the other interesting factor here is that lithium and batteries and electric vehicles, right, all nested together, are really policy dependent markets because
Mhm.
they relate to an intentional political, change or project to really shift our energy system. And so politics introduces its own volatility, but I'll put that aside for a moment. But just to say that, in the late 2010s, early 2020s, we got more and more policies, especially in China, but also in Europe and then in the US, to promote electric vehicle adoption. And then we also had a pandemic. We had a lot of snarled supply chains. There was a lot of backlogs and different inventories out there across the broader global economy. That meant, all of these factors together meant lithium prices went where they never went, like just totally high and really sustained. Like other things, other commodities started to settle down, but lithium was like on its high, for, a full year, a year and a half, really high prices. Then that really crashed. And some of that has to do with like the supply chains like unsnarled a bit and like inventories were able to catch up with where demand was. Some of it was policy change. So of course in the US, but also in Europe and in different markets, there were some rollbacks or slowdowns to like the EV promotion. And there's also the cost of living crisis, which in a lot of places on earth, so that even if governments are promoting things, maybe people don't want to buy an expensive new asset. So, for lots of reasons, geopolitics, and we go down the list because you get the idea that these markets are affected by many different variables. We had a bit of a slowdown in demand, not really in China, but like on a global scale, there was a slowdown. And so that sent prices down, which then has this perverse, or not perverse, but like interesting like impact, which is when the prices go down, great for consumers, but companies that want to invest in mining are like, oh, this doesn't really cash out. Like we're expecting a certain price point of the end product in order to like make our initial investment and all the fixed costs of mining, the physical plant, the construction, the training of the workforce, the technology, because now mining has a lot of tech elements to it too. Like that takes a long time to do and is risky. And so you don't want to do it when the price is in the floor. Unless you have a very long time horizon and you can weather that storm, like you're probably not going to do it. So then when the price crashes, this is almost done, but it's going to kind of come full circle. Then we might have less supply on the market, or at least over the next few years, because there's less investment. And then we can get constrained supply again if the demand picks up. So that's the cycle, right? It's sort of it's its own, it's like an internal logic of how commodity markets work and of the fact that you can't immediately produce a bunch of minerals just because there's demand for them. because mines, as you said, and I detail in the book, can take a decade, can take 15 years, in some jurisdictions 20 years to go from like the deposit discovery and maybe the kind of early stages of just getting your exploration done to the licensing, the permitting, the full financing of it, and then bringing it to an operational mine. Again, a decade, 15 years, et cetera, elapses between point A and point B there. And so 10 years is a lot of different market cycles to go through and a lot of different crazy geopolitical stuff and changes in consumption and whatever. So it can be a real mismatch, and there are ways to deal with this with planning, with stockpiling, with forward-looking policies, with prioritization of, okay, we have this stuff on the market now, what's the best use case for it? It's manageable. Like it's not an impossible, it's not rocket science, it's not impossible. But the way our world is set up right now, given the geopolitical tensions and given the also countries in some cases reducing trade with one another or rerouting how they're trading, it is making this an even more complex problem to solve. And I think the last thing I'll just say on this point is that all of this also brings to the fore the extremely important role of governments and just politics and the state in general in getting resource sectors off the ground, so to speak. That, all of this turbulence in markets, there are, as I said, policy maneuvers that can try to address this, both on the front of how long does a mine take to build. So you mentioned, in some ways it takes forever, but sometimes governments try to really cut corners and like fast track and ram things through. That doesn't always work, but it unfortunately can work sometimes. It can be effective to just try to push a project forward with a lot of political will. But governments are also playing an increasingly important role in financing, right? Which brings politics in a broader sense to the table, in that it's our tax dollars in the US, and I can get into specifics if we want, but also in Europe and elsewhere in the world, that are helping to finance these gargantuan projects that have very high upfront capital needs.
Well, and I think something that kind of building off of that, and without going too far into the weeds of the kind of industrial policy you're alluding to, it brings me back a little bit to something that we alluded to and that you say early in the book, that this kind of idea of everything will happen at once. And, I want to put that in conversation with, you identify somewhere, depending on whose estimate you go off of, somewhere between 2028 and like 2025, 2035, we're going to start having lithium shortages, right? That we're going to start to have more demand than we actually have supply of. And then in this kind of everything happening at once, you're thinking about the climate crisis really coming to the fore, that mining will suddenly be moving, that we'll need more lithium, that the energy transition is going to be further along in this kind of mid-transition place. And suddenly all of these things are going to kind of knock into each other and collapse against each other. And like, we need these resources, we need this supply, we need this thing in this moment. And there's all these various factors competing. So can you talk through a little bit, what are some of the ways we might think ahead of that and mitigate? Because I think one of the things you're thinking about throughout the book is, if we know there are going to be these challenges coming, yeah, what are some of the ways that we can address that and try to get ahead of those shortages? And you've alluded to some of that's policy, but there's also, I think, other solutions you're thinking about in terms of maybe ways we can reduce some of our demand and the way that we can think about the future in the world we want to be building.
Absolutely. Yeah, there are lots of ways to get ahead on this problem, and I appreciate you framing it that way. I think that, the typical like corporate or government or even more like mainstream expert response to that. I want to set this up in a contrasting way so listeners can kind of hear the range. Like the typical response to that question is we need to find ways to increase supply.
Mhm.
That if there's going to be a gap between supply and demand, if there's going to be an imbalance, the way to correct that is to black box demand, just assume demand as a constant, or it just comes from people's like consumer desires and there's nothing to do with that or industry needs or whatever. And we need to figure out how to get more stuff out of the ground. And that makes sense. That is a way to close the gap between supply and demand. And no, there are elements of that I might even entertain in certain contexts, but I don't actually think that that's the best approach, at least for my values and the way I envision an energy transition and real climate action, which is I think we need to think a lot more about how to reduce and modulate and prioritize demand, and think about demand as something that is much more amenable to shaping than something that is just like some inherent desire that people have to consume a certain amount of lithium like in their electric vehicles. Like that's just not true. And we know, I mean, marketing programs at business schools exist for a reason. Like, and advertising budgets are sometimes the hugest part of corporate budgets for a reason. Like, demand is downstream of so many other forces, whether it is direct publicity and marketing on the parts of companies that try to tell us we need huge cars and also huge electric vehicles, right? And that's how to feel powerful and masculine or rich or how to go on a great road trip. You know, all of these types of advertisements from the car industry do a lot to shape consumer demand. And then there's also broader cultural forces as well as our built material environment in the US that favors a certain type of consumer lifestyle, whether it's, you know, the single family home, highways, long commutes, certain forms of consumer-based leisure, like and yeah, those are pretty sedimented in American culture and have an origin point like in the 1950s, kind of a while ago. But they too are, you know, our grandparents didn't actually grow up with that exact consumer lifestyle like that. It's still relatively recent and it all is subject to different historical forces, but we could more intentionally try to change it. And so where I'm going with this maybe type of philosophical point is that the more we can think about how to use resources efficiently and equitably, the less of them we need, and the more social impact their use has, the more positive impact their use has. And the more I would say, from an ethical standpoint, we could justify, perhaps, or at least weigh that against some of the real harms of their extraction. I think the reason that the ethical dilemma that motivated this book felt so fraught and still feels quite fraught to me is that we're going about the energy transition in the most if we're even doing an energy transition, again putting that aside, maybe not such a transition in the US right now, but over time we're seeing movement towards renewables and elsewhere in China it's rapid, etc. We are going about it in the most resource intensive way possible because in the US at least we're not touching any of the core drivers or causes of resource consumption. And so, you know, yeah, if we continue to live in like suburban, you know, single family homes that are in many cases bigger than they need to be and therefore use a lot of energy, if we consider to drive enormous vehicles, yes, those are going to need bigger batteries. And that those bigger batteries require really significant amount more raw materials than smaller batteries do. And so all of this matters. And what's interesting and hopeful to me is that the same exact policy choices and consumer choices and social choices that would make an energy transition require less mining are the same choices that would address climate change more rapidly. They're the same. They're not opposed. That's kind of what I was hinting at earlier in our discussion. So
Mhm.
let me be much more concrete. The more we can open up more mobility options to people. And I frame it that way intentionally. I know that some people do not have an immediate other option than the car and the highway. But what if we gave them one, right? And so I'm not blaming individuals for their constrained choices. But I know, and because I'm in my own household, this is an issue. Like a lot of households might share a car. It can be really difficult. Like all of us have to commute in different directions. Traffic is terrible. The issue with car fatalities and accidents is completely out of control in the U.S. in a way it unmatched by any other society. And cars are increasingly costly. You know, gasoline's not at its highest, but sometimes it's expensive. But the cars themselves are really costly to finance, and they're starting to rival rent and mortgages for like monthly expenses for people. And so what if we were like, we're going to build a light rail or we're going to build a dedicated, you know, rapid bus lane here so that you can get to work and, you know, your partner can use the car that day. Again, it doesn't have to be immediate radical change of everything, but just starting to expand people's mobility options so they don't have to take the car. And then it turns out people like being able to sit and chill on their commute and not be enraged during traffic. Maybe that will cultivate more desire for mass transit, build more of a constituency for it. Or there's places where people already are demanding more reliable buses, more frequent, like big metro areas,
Mhm.
New York City, Chicago, Boston, you know, LA, where there's like built-in constituencies for this stuff. They're mad that there's not enough public transit. We could keep going with other examples, but the more that we can expand mobility and electric mobility beyond the electric vehicle, the less per person resource use there is and therefore the less total resource use there is. And then we can do cool stuff like we can also, you know, you mentioned this earlier, all those lithium batteries can be recycled. We can get all the lithium back out of them. And so if we put in policies to really incentivize that or maybe to require it on the manufacturer end, then we could make a lot of headway into not needing as much mining to meet that increasing demand in the future. So, there's a lot of ways, and sometimes they're obvious, like recycling is maybe fairly obvious, but sometimes less obvious, like different mobility or having people live in denser urban environments or denser suburbs can help a lot. The denser places are, the less people actually tend to drive or think they need the huge car or whatever. So there's a lot of ways to align less resource use, more efficiency, and more like socially valuable resource use with like making really rapid progress on the energy transition and climate change. These same practices help both, but it requires some holistic thinking and maybe a little bit of outside of the box from like the kind of accepted understanding of what the American lifestyle is, which is a lifestyle that, by the way, is very unequal, driving lots of people a little bit crazy, is increasingly costly to working and middle class people. There's a lot of reasons to rethink some of these basics, not just lithium, but I'm bringing my own angle to it. But I think it's a much broader set of issues that are in public debate for other reasons as well.
No, and I think you're spot on with just even small things like making our cars smaller. Our cars were
Yep.
not always this big. We did not always all have to drive SUVs. And the simple realities around the fact of, it's funny you bring up the 50s. My house was built in the 1960s, and every time I have to drive into the little two-car garage in my modern car, I'm just acutely aware my car is not the same size as whatever the intended vehicle to fit in
Yep.
that garage was in the 1960s. So, I mean, we have changed our culture, and the idea that it is unchangeable in a new direction, I think is a bad read of history, personally, as somebody with a history background. So, Dr.
Totally agree.
Riofrancos, we are at the end of our time, but I so appreciate this conversation. The book is Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. Dr. Thea Riofrancos is the author. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Weston.
Now we'll go to our researcher, Sophia, who is another in her series on urban parks all around Houston.
It's Sophia, and welcome back to Urban Explorer, where we find wild places and city spaces. Today, we're going to visit Bethel Park. For those who haven't gotten the chance to visit yet, hopefully I can sway you. But before I do that, I wanted to share some information about the area. Bethel Park was founded in 2013 and happens to be situated where the old Bethel Missionary Baptist Church, which was one of the oldest churches in the Fourth Ward, used to be located. The church was founded in 1891 and was built by emancipated slaves alongside Reverend Jack Yates. The church unfortunately faced a variety of difficulties, including a hurricane and a couple of fires, but now the 3 walls, floor, and concrete pillars that remain have been stabilized, and the plot of land has been restored into a public park. Without further ado, let's go check it out. So I just left Bethel Park and I took some time to go around the whole property, look inside of the old church building, and enjoy some of the natural amenities as well. So I can confidently tell you, you should definitely check this out. As you walk in, the first thing you see is this huge, beautiful building that used to be the old church. It has these lovely colored glass windows coming in all different colors. And as you walk into the building, they have information plaques all over the place, just telling you about the area, the history of the church, and even more beyond that. So this would be a great place to come with family and friends if you're in the area, or even if you just want to learn more about this historical part of Houston's Fourth Ward. Even if you just want to come sit out on some of the benches under the trees, enjoy the natural scenery, it's a great place to come relax, learn something, and get outside a little bit. So if you're thinking about it, definitely do it. As I mentioned, make sure to come check out Bethel Park if you want to learn more about the history of Houston's Fourth Ward, or even if you just want to rest and soak in some of the nature on the property. The story behind Bethel Park is definitely worth a visit to learn about, and the maintained and serene natural areas on the property beyond the church are surely an added bonus. As the city of Houston continues to change, visiting this park and others have been a good reminder to me to appreciate the history of the city as well as the almost therapeutic effect that can come from spending some time in little pockets of nature. Thank you so much for tuning in, and make sure to come back soon to learn more about unique and fun parks in the Houston area.
That's our show for this week. If you have questions or ideas for what you'd like featured on Gulf Streams, leave a voicemail at 713-348-4081. That's 713-348-4081. Or email us at westonT@rice.edu. A quick reminder that you can catch up on Gulf Streams anytime through our podcast, available on all major podcast platforms. If you enjoy the show, please like and subscribe to make sure you never miss an episode. Gulf Streams is a co-production of KPFT Houston and Rice's Center for Environmental Studies and the Rice Sustainability Institute's Eco Studio. Produced by Weston Twardowski. Original music by Carter Dean. Research support provided by Sophia Soltez, Sarah Tabrez, and Antara Varma. Stay tuned for No Expectations with Marcus French here on KPFT Houston 90.1 FM, Galveston 89.5 FM, and Huntsville 89.7 FM.